Okie dokie. I think I'm streaming now. I haven't tried this in a while, but hopefully it's working. We're gonna read some stuff. So I have to get the article into Hypernomicon. Step one. Whoops. So I guess you can't see what's going on. Let me change. Whatever. You're not going to be able to see some stuff in Hypernomicon, but that's okay because we just started the stream, so this is just bookkeeping stuff. I have to enter the author and so on, so you'll be able to see that. Okay. Okay. Okie dokie. Great, we're good to go. So, it's time to start reading. I don't know how the volume is. If anybody shows up in chat, let me know how the volume is. Obviously, people showing up in chat will not have heard me say this. Let's adjust this. Let's adjust the zoom. Good. We're going to skip the, well, let's read the abstract. What's wrong with imposing pure risks? That is, risks that will materialize into harm. Yeah. According to popular response, imposing pure risk is protest are wrong when, because risk itself is harmful, called this the harm view. Defenders of the view make one of the following two claims on the constitutive claim, pure risk. Maybe you can't. Let's put the microphone. Let's put the microphone over here. On the contingent claim, pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong when it becomes risks of harmful consequences for the risk bearers, such as psychological distress. This paper argues that the harm view is plausible only on the contingent claim but fails on the constitutive claim. I think I missed reading the constitutive claim. Pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong when and because risk constitutes diminishing one's well-being, illicit preference, frustration, or setting back their legitimate interest in autonomy. This paper argues that the harm view is plausible only on the contingent claim, fails on the constitutive claim. In discussing the latter, argue that both the preference and autonomy account fail to show that risk itself is constitutively harmful and therefore wrong. In discussing the former, argue that risk itself is contingently harmful and thereby wrong, but only in a narrow range of cases. I conclude that while the harm view can sometimes explain the wrong of imposing risk when and because risk itself is contingently harmful, it's unsuccessful as a general exhaustive account of what makes pure imposition wrong. Philosophers discussing the ethics of risk imposition typically focus on cases of pure risk where the risk harms fail to materialize. I only focus on the risk of harm. Moreover, for the purposes of the paper, I use the term pure risk interchangeably with imposing pure risk imposition, and risking harm. Here are two familiar examples. Bill drives recklessly, risking the lives of pedestrians, but luckily nothing happens. Bill plays a game of Russian roulette with his friends, but luckily the friend survives. In such cases, Bill could have actually hit one of the pedestrians or killed his friend, but Bill did none of these things, yet what Bill did seems wrong. What then explains it? According to one popular response, Bill's pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong, one because risk itself is harmful, regardless of whether the risked harm materializes. Henceforth, I'll occasionally drop the term pro tanto for simplicity. Call this the harm view. Defenders of this view can interpret it as making one of the following claims. For the distinction is often overlooked in recent discussions of the harm view. See, for instance, Oberdiak and Parr and Slavny. On what I call the constitutive claim, pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong when and because risk constitutes or counts as making the risk bearer intrinsically worse off in some respect. In arguing for this claim, influential accounts look at the constitutive risk of harm and the risk bearer's well-being being diminished, illicit reference frustration, or in their legitimate interest in autonomy being set back. For the purpose of the paper, I'll only focus on the preference and autonomy account. Other closely related accounts that argue for the constitutive claim include Adriana Placani's dignity account, Jonathan Harrington's Lazar's security account, and Maria Ferretti's freedom account. Where necessary, I've indicated my discussion applies to these alternative accounts too. Too many risk accounts. By contrast, what I call the contingent claim, pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong when and because risk has harmful consequences for the risk bearer, for example, psychological distress, such as fear and anxiety. Okay, I think everybody accepts the contingent claim, right? it's only the constitutive claim people argue about. I think the harm view offers a sufficient but not necessary condition for explaining the wrongness of imposing pure risk on others. That is, if the risk itself is constitutively or contingently harmful, then this generates a moral reason against built risk imposition that can be outweighed by other countervailing considerations, while some philosophers find the view appealing, others have expressed doubts. For instance, some find it puzzling how imposing pure risk of harm on others can count as the same thing as harming them. Hearing Gardner, as Arneson puts it, the sheer risk of suffering harm is just that, a risk of suffering harm and not itself a harm. I guess I want that somewhere in here just because Arneson says it, and he was my dissertation chair. The sheer risk of suffering harm is just that, a risk of suffering harm and not itself a harm. Whoa. Oh no. Revert. Revert. What does the revert button do? I've never lost that much of a. I've never lost that much of a position before in Hypernomicon, but I couldn't see what I was typing, and I deleted a lot of stuff. I hope all I lost was the Arneson thing. I can go back and watch the stream to find out what disappeared. Oh god. I hate this bug that I can't see what I'm typing in Hypernomicon. Okay, good enough. If it is, then it's unclear how the harmfulness of risk itself should be discounted from the well-being of those for whom the risk never materialized. Some question whether this is even possible without running into circularity or without double counting harm. For responses to the last two objections, C.F. Placani, others who doubt the plausibility of the harm view for different reasons include Jews, Thompson, Stephen Perry, and Joseph Bowen. Unpublished manuscript. What's this Bowen thing? All right, well, there is a Joseph Bowen manuscript cited in the paper, but not in the works cited section. So it's going to be a mystery for the rest of time until this thing gets published. Maybe I'm just going to Google it. I think this is But You Could Have Hurt Me, Risk and Harm by Bowen, 2022 in Law and Philosophy. Cool. This paper argues that the harm view is plausible only on the contingent claim, but fails on the constitutive claim. In discussing the constitutive claim, I argue that both the preference and autonomy account fail to show that risk itself is constitutively harmful and therefore wrong. In discussing the contingent claim, I argue that the risk itself is contingently harmful and therefore wrong, but only in a narrow range of cases. I conclude that while the harm view can sometimes explain the wrong of imposing risk, when because risk makes itself contingently harmful, it's unsuccessful at the general exhaustive account of what makes pure imposition wrong. The paper proceeds in 5 sections. Section 1 covers 2 important preliminaries. I offer clarification of key concepts and then discusses the significance of the harm view in our practical deliberations. Section 2 tackles the constitutive claim by focusing on the preference count as developed by Claire Finkelstein or Steen. Section 3 tackles the contingent claim by focusing on the autonomy account as developed by John O'Berdick. Section 4 discusses the contingent claim. Section 5 concludes. Before we proceed, clarifying key concepts is essential. In particular, we need a conception of harm and risk. First, consider harm. Defenders of the harm view hold that the harm of risk is both conceptually and ontologically distinct from the harm that is a risk. The distinction between the two, theorists often employ the terminology of risk harm to refer to the former and outcome harm to refer to the latter. Let's put these terms in here. So these will be nested under harm and under risk. Risk harm. Yeah. Risk harm. Harm of a risk. And outcome harm. Okie dokie. As the central focus of the harm view is risk harm, constitutive or contingent, the risk must specify its two components, the currency and the measure of harm. The former concerns the subset of bad things that can happen to the risk bearer, the latter concerns the degree to which someone is harmed. As we'll see, the precise contours of these two components are drawn differently on different accounts. Second, consider risk. On the standard account, risk is simply the conditional probability of a bad outcome for someone. Probabilities come in two varieties, namely objective and epistemic probabilities. Objective probabilities are determined by the physical feature of the world. They're mind independent, typically interpreted in terms of relative frequencies. By contrast, epistemic probabilities are mind dependent and denote either an agent's degree of belief or degree of support given by available evidence for a hypothesis. In arguing for the harm view, most theorists take the salient probabilities to be the objective ones. For a critique of the harm view, for its failure to account for epistemic probabilities, see Parr and Slavny. For now, let's assume that the cases that interest us, the relevant objective probabilities are available. If it's wrong to impose risk on others in virtue of risk harm, this carries both theoretical and practical implications. First, the notion of harm is central to the normative, political, and legal theorizing. For instance, distinct versions of so-called harm principle are aimed at criminalizing harmful conduct according to John Stuart Mill's canonical formulation. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over an individual against his will is to prevent harm to others. Ordinarily, Mill's harm principle applies when one suffers actual or expected outcome harm. If the harm view is correct, then there's a prima facie case for the principle to warrant restricting or constraining risk impositions in light of actual or expected risk harm, in addition to the actual or expected outcome harm one might suffer. Secondly, we routinely confront and manage risks of falling ill or infecting others, or the risk of losing our job during a financial crisis, or the risk of facing life-threatening accidents and environmental disaster, and so on. If the harm view is correct, then governments, health organizations, insurance companies need to take there's an and missing, need to take account of risk harm in addition to the actual or expected outcome harm that individuals may suffer when making decisions about safety policies, distributing benefits and risks, and so on. Some even suggested that risk harm is crucial for thinking about compensating individuals for living with various climate change risks, although climate change exposes many current and future generations to various risks of climate-related losses. A relatively smaller number would actually incur any real outcome harm. However, the harm view is correct, and compensation for harm should not be limited to those who suffer outcome harm, but should be extended to a large majority of those individuals who suffer risk harm, but who are lucky enough not to suffer outcome harm at all, and not to suffer outcome harm. All other things being equal. Third, beside questions of compensation, the plausibility of the harm view is also relevant for questions of liability and punishment within both tort and criminal law. Wrongful harming them and harmless wrongdoing is a necessary condition for judgments of legal responsibility for exposing others to the risk. If the harm view is correct, then risk harm could itself serve the basis for holding individuals liable, as well as imposing sanctions for wrongful behavior in well-known cases of victimless crime, such as dangerous driving, careless handling of firearms, and so on. These are some important features that motivate a thorough discussion of the harm view. Let's begin with examining the constitutive claim. I'm standing on one foot sometimes, so I may be toppling over. The constitutive claim holds that the pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong, one, because risk constitutes or counts as making the risk bearer intrinsically worse off in some respect. I'll put this in, the risk of harm is a harm. Okay, so she calls it the constitutive claim. Rowe calls it the risk harm thesis. I'm sure it has many names. What exactly is it to make someone worse off? Diminishes their well-being. We can spell this out further. Substantive theory of well-being. According to Claire Finkelstein, the plausible candidate is preference satisfaction. Finkelstein starts by spelling out harm and the preference in the currency of legitimate interest, but later states that she's using the term interest as synonym for preference. She ultimately connects this view with an actualist preference satisfaction view of well-being. By noting that an agent has an interest in all and only those items that correspond to something he wants or desires. For this reason, I subsume a view into well-being account instead of the interest-based account that I discussed in the next section. On a standard actualist version of this theory, one's well-being at a given time does not merely depend on one's experiential state, such as psychological distress or the achievement of certain objectively valuable goods. Instead, any increase or diminishment of the agent's well-being is determined by the extent to which the world or state of affairs at a given time is or becomes actually how she actually prefers it to be. But focusing on the risk bearer's actual preferences, Finkelstein argues that we can capture the wrongful harm of imposing risk in a perfectly commonsensical way. So we have down here the actual desire satisfaction theory of well-being. What do we call it? Actual desire satisfactionism. Let's not make this a position. Let's make this an argument. Whoop. To illustrate, she offers the following example. Suppose Bill fails to repair his airplane's engine, thereby flies a defective airplane. His negligence exposes these passengers to a heightened risk of dying in a plane crash. The moment of risk and position say it's empty. The passengers belong to a reference class of people in which the relative frequency of dying in a defective airplane is greater than the reference class of people who fly in non-defective airplanes, according to the preference count. Exposing passengers to the risk of dying entails a reduction in their well-being that is harms them at T because they prefer to be in the latter reference class, facing lower negligible risk of dying, rather than the former, facing higher risk of dying. Thus, risk itself is constitutively harmful by virtue of frustrating one's preferences, therefore rendering Bill's imposition of risk wrong. So the title of the article, and so far most of the substance of the article, is whether the imposition of risk is a harm. But she's going further and says not only is it a harm, but it's wrong. I think we're just gonna ignore that. Finkelstein further notes that on the ex post judgment, the case say at some subsequent time t+1, the harmless of the risk persistence doesn't evaporate the moment it's clear no outcome harm will result. However, whether this really the case depends on whether the passengers really suffer a genuine frustration of some preferences ex ante, that is at t. And in contrast, Harrington thinks Finkelstein in making a case that ex post preference to have been set to have been free from risk. Okay, inquiring about this requires us to first identify the frustrated preference in question. As Finkelstein relies on the actualist preferentialist theory, this preference must be intrinsic rather than instrumental. In the discussion that follows, I focus only on actual preferences, preference account, as that is the focus of Finkelstein's account. Others may appeal to some version of an ideal fairly informed preference theory. In this theory, relevant preferences are ones that an idealized agent would possess were she to really fully rational and full information about the risks. My objectives to the preference count hold, even if one were to appeal the ideal rather than actual preferences about risk. You probably can't read. You can't read. You can't see the footnotes when I'm reading them. My bad. Nothing I can do about that. I got a big monitor over here. And so the footnotes are very far down. On this theory, only preferences for things that are in there that are for their own sake count towards one well-being at time t. Moreover, the theory holds that one is harmed if it's both true that one prefers some state of affairs that is the object someone desire at t obtain, and the state of affairs fails to obtain concurrently at t. So after both of these t's, we're missing a space. There's some, I feel like, and this is happening down here too. I feel like in some, like in PDF programs, when I copy and paste, there's like an italic, and then a space, and then a parentheses, it always misses the space or something like that. That happens somewhere, or I'm typing, it happens somewhere, and it seems to be replicated here. Keeping these aspects in mind, there are at least two preferences that qualify as possible candidates for what makes risk conditionally harmful. One's general intrinsic preference at T, not to be exposed to risk per se, or one's general intrinsic preference at T, not to suffer outcome harm at T or at any subsequent time, say at T plus 1. Below, I argue that for both these possibilities, the preference count fails to show that risk itself is constitutionally harmful, thereby undermining its plausibility as an account of explicating the wrong of imposing risk in terms of risk harm. Others have objected that Finkelstein's view for different reasons. For instance, John Alberti objects that the harm identified by the preference frustration is of the wrong kind. Jonathan Harrington objects that Finkelstein's account faces a dilemma between embracing an implausible actual desire theory or embracing an ideal theory that fails to account for risk. Great. Let's begin with one. So, general intrinsic preference not to be exposed. It's plausible that many individuals possess a preference to be free from risk at a given moment of time. For instance, the fact that we buy health and travel insurance, wear safety belts, build earthquake-prone homes, and build earthquake-prone homes. Proof, I believe, is the word we want. And so on is indicative of that. Acknowledging this, some theorists think that preference rightly captures the harm of being exposed to risk at T. Harrington, 2019. Harrington, 2019 thinks this is plausible and general description of the preference theory. I don't understand that footnote. However, other things being equal, such an account plausibly entails that individuals are continually made worse off harmed, given the widely held assumption that virtually every action we perform carries some risk for others. We quickly run into a kind of paralysis. Hay and Jim and Welf raise a similar problem of paralysis for rights-based theories, the idea that it's impossible to assign individuals the right not to be subjected to risk without their consent, insofar as virtually every action carries with it some risk, however small, of serious harm to others. Let's find this paper real quick. This is an overview article. Download. Okay. This is by Madeline Hyen Young and Jonathan Wolf. Cool. Okay, what's it called? If it's simply impossible to ensure non-frustration of individuals' preferences to be free from risk at any given moment of time, we cannot help but constantly harm others by performing our most mundane everyday actions. This merely implies we have potential reason against most of our everyday actions. Insofar as performing these actions, we frustrate others' preferences to be free of risk per se. If the preference count has this implication, doesn't necessarily make the account implausible. I think an anonymous reviewer for pressing me on this point. The underlying issue here, however, is that the preference count renders most of our ordinary actions as instances of harm and thereby wrong. Here, again, she's going from harm to wrong. How, I ask you, even those who are willing to accept that our ordinary actions are portent are wrong by virtue of carrying a smaller, even serious risk of harm for others, might find it unacceptable that an account renders our ordinary actions wrong because harmful for at least two related reasons. Every time she's jumping from harm to wrongful. First, it seems to stretch the notion of harm beyond its ordinary limits. It treats too wide a range of cases, instances of harming, and doing so it absolves the relative seriousness of imposing outcome harm on someone, much against our commonly held intuitions. For instance, causing someone excruciating pain is much more serious than causing them to suffer risk harm by virtue of frustrating their preference not to be exposed to an increased risk of suffering excruciating pain. Okay, I don't understand this. And second, the account risks undermining or trivializing the special moral significance many theorists attribute to harm. Most agree we have strong reasons and often even a strong obligation not to harm others. However, the preference account problematically entails that in performing ordinary actions, we fail to observe this duty by virtue of harming others. We elicit frustrating their preference not to be subject to risk per se. We're missing the end of the argument, and so okay, let's start putting this in Hypernomicon. Oy. So this goes in, and then her objection to it goes in. So this is three. One. One with two considerations. So it stretches harm beyond its ordinary limits, and so it absolves the relative seriousness of imposing outcome harm on someone. Much against their commonly held intuitions. For instance, causing someone excruciating pain is much more serious than causing them to suffer risk harm. This argument doesn't say one is worse or as bad as the other. It just says they're bad. Also, the account risks undermining or trivializing the special moral significance of many theorists. Most agree that strong reasons how the preference duty problematic entails them performing ordinary actions. Failure to observe this duty. Okay. Oh, there's more. Perhaps we can simply modify one and concede one's preferences against specific risk under specific conditions as a relevant candidate. For instance, suppose we only care about a passenger's preference not to be exposed to non-consensual higher or increased risk of dying in a defective airplane crash. This narrows the range of relevant cases without leading to paralysis as before. Still, a number of problems remain. Oh. First, the account makes the constitutive harm of risk contingent on agents having preferences about the specific risk they face. This makes the account extensionally inadequate in at least two kinds of cases. One case where risk bearers have no actual preferences about the risk in question, and two cases where we simply cannot appeal the risk bearer's preferences. As an illustration of the first case, think of a newly born baby who's on board and also exposed to the risk of dying in a plane crash because of Bill's conduct. Baby, however, does not herself have any actual preferences for or against being subject to the risk. An illustration of the second case, think of our currently non-existing future generations who are subject to climate change risks because of our actions. We do not know anything about their preferences regarding these risks and also in general. In these cases, there's a strong intuition that imposing a risk is wrong, but this intuition cannot be captured or explained by appealing to the constitutive harm of risk, frustrating one's preferences. That's fine. I'm not even going to put that in hypernomicon. Seems correct and pretty trivial. The second general problem is that the preference account generates counterintuitive verdicts in at least two kinds of cases. One where agents have actual preferences for being subject to higher risks of harm, and two cases where an agent's actual preference for being subject to risk is based on a mistaken or false belief that the risk of harm or the exposure to the risk itself is good for them. In illustration, the first case, think of the low risk loving passenger who strongly prefers to fly in defective planes because the risk involved gives her an adrenaline rush. As an illustration of the second case, think of the risk-seeking passenger who prefers to fly in a defective plane because she wrongly and mistakenly believes that facing a higher chance of death will bring her good fortune. In these cases, the risk itself does constitute any harm, but let's say first assume that the risk bearer's preferences. Currently, because the risk is not harmful, the preference account delivers the verdict that Bill's risky conduct isn't wrong. Contrary double space to our intuition that Bill in fact asks wrongly. Let's put that in here. That's just a fun little argument. All of this so far I've been putting under objective risk harm, but this is also under wrongness. But we're going to keep it under harm. I've been getting a lot of spam in my Gmail account. I wonder why. But perhaps we can put these problem cases aside. The preference count only needs to deliver the correct verdict in some cases to affirm the risk is constitutionally harmful and thereby wrong. Let's reconsider the airplane example. Suppose you're one of the passengers. Suppose I inform you that because of Bill's negligence, you belong to a reference class consisting of all the individuals who fly in defective airplanes. Affirm the relative frequency of dying in plane crashes 50%. Had Bill not acted carelessly, you would have traveled in a safer airplane and faced much lower risk. Is Bill's recent position constitutionally harmful and therefore wrong on the preference account? The answer depends on what you prefer and whether Bill's acts frustrate that preference. Suppose you respond by saying that you prefer not to face 50% risk of dying. That's labeled as your preference P. If we measure the harm meter that kept a record of when risk is constitutionally harmful, the meter registers the harm of risk in position at T. Why? Because Bill's actions bring about a state of affairs at T, namely exposing you to 50% risk of dying, frustrating P at T. The preference account thus delivers the verdict that Bill's recent position is wrong in virtue of harming you, but elicit a desire frustration. This judgment, however, can be questioned. It seems to hold true only on a particular description of the state of affairs. The risk itself that obtained because of what Bill does at T. There, however, other ways of describing the state of affairs is well known. In a relative frequency interpretation of objective risk, the risk that one imposes upon another is defined relative to whatever reference class one selects. It's thus presumed that there is no singular correct risk that one is exposed to at a given time, but rather multiple risks each defined relative to a certain specific reference class. Accordingly, since a particular individual can belong to many such reference classes, there are, at least in principle, many different descriptions or actions, characterizations or descriptions of a risk that one's exposed to. There's no strict criteria for characterizing a risk to one way or the other that can vary with context and purpose. This is well-known reference class problem. Suppose I tell you that because of Bill's risky actions, you also belong to a reference class consisting of all those individuals who fly in airplanes on a Thursday, and for whom the relative frequency of dying is 5%. Accordingly, the harmometer does not register that risk constitutes a harm at T. Why? Because Bill's actions bring about a state of affairs at T, namely exposing you to a 5% risk of dying that doesn't frustrate P at T, and the preference account thus delivers the verdict that Bill's recent position is not wrong insofar as it's not constitutionally harmful to elicit desire frustration. According to status of risk being constitutionally harmful on your harmometer changes as we go about redescribing risk at T. It changes with whether or not the description of your state of affairs risk that obtains at T corresponds with the frustration or satisfaction of your integral preference at T, since both and many others simultaneously. Oh, I forgot to change the title of my stream. Stream information. Oh no, that's fine. It's okay. Accordingly, since both and many other simultaneous characterizations of the risk are plausible, that is, the risk you face at T can be both 50% or 5% or something else. Depending on our chosen reference class, the preference account entails that risk can be both constitutionally harmful and not harmful to elicit frustration of your desire at P at T. Desire at T at time P. Your desire at time P. The upshot is that the contrasting judgment regarding the harm suffered by you results in at least two contrasting judgments. The wrongness of Bill's risk imposition, since Bill does not frustrate your preference beyond one description of risk. What he does is not protect a wrong. At the same time, all he does is protect a wrong and a distinct description of the risk, even though Bill happens to perform exactly the same action. This is an odd consequence. Is it? Is that an odd consequence? Okay. However, it's an inevitable one for the preference account. The reason is as follows. On actualist preference account, so the preferentialist theory that Finkelstein relies on, increments or diminishments of well-being, consistent in achieving the optimal overall match between the way things are and the way we want them to be, whatever we may happen to want. In the case of risk, the way things are, that is, the risk you face can be described in a multitude of ways. The fact that the risk you at T of 5% relative to a particular reference class is mind-independent feature. State of the world described in one way, but so is the fact that at T, the risk is 10% relative to a different reference class. Accordingly, whether or not the risk one faces is constitutionally harmful depends on and varies with whenever there is a one-to-one optimal match or correspondence between the object of one's risk preference P and the concurrent obtaining of a particular state of affairs. Risk one faces described in a certain way. This entails the possibility that risk can be both harmful and not harmful at the same time. This makes the preference count implausible for at least two reasons. First, it seems to vindicate the odd conception of constitutive harm of risks is that whether it obtains, as well as the degree to or extent to which it obtains, depends on the way we choose to describe risk and, of course, surrounding frustration of individual specific preferences for that risk. The audience comes to light. Double space. When we consider the paradigm case of harm, such as causing someone pain, if I stab my friend this late with a stone, whether or not he suffers pain is not in any way relative to my description of what I do. The question is not whether or not he suffers pain. The question is whether it's wrong. And of course, okay. Sorry, I'll keep going. Second, the account seems to controversially rely on the idea that individuals have very specific fine grained preferences corresponding to which the reference class they are exposed to, and there is a natural or obvious way of individuating such preferences. It's also not clear whether individuals actually have such fine grained preferences in the first place, and whether these can in fact be individuated and measured in any clear or systematic manner. Thus, it seems that we cannot unproblematically locate the constituent harm of risk and frustration of one's preference against specific risk. Sure. I guess I should put this in here. Sure, if I need to be putting these parenthetical citations in here now that we have the where made thing. Moving forward, there's one final candidate left to be explored. It seems prima facie plausible that if passengers prefer not to be harmed, they incur an injury at any given point in time, then being exposed to the risk of getting injured frustrates this preference. Let's label this preference as P star. The object of P star is distinct from the preference P considered earlier. The intentional content of the former corresponds to one's desire not to be exposed to outcome harm per se, whereas the intentional content of the latter corresponds to one's desire not to be exposed to risk per se. When Bill imposes the risk of plane crash at T, it's both indeterminate and beyond Bill's control whether or not the object of P star, namely outcome harm, will in fact obtain at P or some later time. Thus, we could say that ex ante, the imposition of risk itself entails or constitutes frustration of P star, even if the risk eventually doesn't materialize ex post. Note this is different from saying Bill's risk imposition at T entails a risk of frustration of P star, such that the accidental frustration of P star is conditional on risk materializing. Currently, perhaps Bill's risk position is at T is constitutionally harmful and therefore wrong because risk frustrates P star at T. There are, however, two problems with the proposal. First, on the commonly accepted accounts of preferentialist theories, the harm, that is, reduction of well-being of an episode or an instance of preference frustration, is a product of two things: the intensity of the desire in question, more intense desire, more valuable its frustration, and the duration of the episode. Now compare two cases involving the frustration of P star. In case one, Bill exposes you to a very high risk of injury, say 50% for 1 hour. In case two, Bill exposes you to a very low risk of injury, say 1% for 1 hour. Suppose the intensity of P star, namely your desire not to be injured, remains constant in both cases, say the intensity is 10 units. Furthermore, suppose only the duration of the episode of desire frustration varies in both. Here's what an actualist preferentialist theory will say about the constitutive risk of harm, other things being equal: use of 10 units of harm, product of intensity 10, and duration 1 hour in both cases. Accordingly, if it's true that Bill's risk position is constitutively harmful when and because he frustrates P star, then the preference account delivers the verdict that Bill wrongs you to the same extent whether he exposes you to to either a 1% risk of injury or 50%. This, however, is counterintuitive. Intuitively, if risk is constitutively harmful, we elicit frustration from one's desire not to be harmed, then it's worse to expose someone to a very high risk of injury for an hour than to a very low risk for an hour, other things being equal. This is because higher risk frustrate P star more severely, that is more reduction in well-being, and lower risk frustrate P star less so, other things being equal. The preference count, however, cannot capture this. That seems true. I don't know if I'm putting it in hypernomic. The second problem goes as follows. Again, compare two cases involving frustration of P star. In one case, Bill exposes you to a very high risk of injury, say 50%, but the risk fails to materialize after an hour. In case two, Bill exposes you to a very high risk of injury, say 50%, but this time the risk materializes within a minute, keeping the intensity of P star constant, say 10 in both cases. The actualist preferentialist theory says that on ex post judgment of the case, the harm of risk itself in case two is less than one in case one given time slice. The product of intensity at 1 hour-long frustration of P star in one case is more than product. Yeah, exactly. This runs contrary to our intuitive judgment. No. Whoops. Not mine. The degree of wrongness of Bill's risk imposition more if his actions actually result in outcome harm as compared to the case when he merely imposes pure risk. No. Not the risk imposition. Risk imposition. Okay. I conclude that these considerations count against the considerations count against the success of the preference account in locating the wrongness of emphasizing risk and the risk of being constitutionally harmful. Finkelstein also takes harm of risk is necessary but not sufficient to establish the claim of liability and compensation. However, risk itself is not harmful. As argued contrary to Finkelstein, that raises questions of what, if not the harm of risk itself, grounds liability. Oh, sorry. What's the program? Sorry. Somebody's chat. Welcome, NoGrio1. Program in top left is Hypernomicon. My apologies for missing your chat until just now. Clearly, I have been distracted. I should put, at some point I had somewhere in my stream information about the program. It might still be there, so scroll down. There may be a link to Hypernomicon. But yes, welcome, Nogrio. Thank you for joining the chat. All right, we're moving on. Constitutive claim, risks impact on interests. All right, we're moving on from Finkelstein to Burdick and Plekany and Feinberg. Some theorists have proposed appealing to a distinct currency of risk harm. In particular, they assume a Feinbergian conception of harm and locate the constitutive risk and how constitutive harm and risk and how risk impacts risk bearers' interests rather than our well-being per se. Feinberg differentiates between non-normative legal notion of harm as a setback to an individual's core interests and normative notion of harm as a wrongful setback to interests that involve violation of rights. So Burdick and Plekany appeal to the former notion. Okay. This shift in focus avoids many problems that the preference account faces. Interests, unlike preferences, are just some things that one has a stake in. For instance, what promotes an agent's interest in health is good for her, even if she mistakenly believes the contrary, and even if she really desires ill health. As Feinberg argues, a mere desire, no matter how genuine or intense, doesn't establish an interest in the sense required for establishing a harmed condition on his framework. We're turning up the temperature a bit on the AC because I'm chilly. So, what are those interests? Oh, sorry. Thus, by identifying the interests that can be affected in the manner in which they are affected by the risk itself, we can anchor the wrong of opposing risk in the following way. Other things equal, an agent is made worse, often thereby wronged, when and because risk sets back one or some of her core legitimate interests. What are these interests? According to John Burdick, a plausible candidate is autonomy. He notes that while imposing risk does involve a material harm, like the injuries suffered in a car accident, nevertheless can constitute a setback to a non-material autonomy interest of a certain kind. A related account offered by Plekany is appeals to the risk bearer's dignity interests. On her view, imposing risk on people with the intention of harming them can sometimes undermine their status of people worthy of respect. Cases discussed here, such as Bill's reckless drunk driving or negligence in piling example, do not involve this intention. Accordingly, Kennedy's account, I claim, would not treat them as cases of harmful risking. I don't know if that's right, but I actually haven't read Pagani, so I don't know. Where are we? And think about autonomy. Oberdiak has Joseph Raz's conception in mind. On Raz's account, a person is autonomous if she can be considered the author of her own life. Autonomous living has multiple necessary preconditions, such as having the basic mental capacities for and execute intentions, freedom from coercion and manipulation, being able to chart one's own course through life, and having plentiful or adequate range of options to choose from, according to the autonomy account. In some cases, pure risk imposition constitutes harm and thereby wrongs the agent when and because it hurts a certain precondition of autonomy. Power and Slavny also discuss Berdiak's account, but treat it as an alternative to the harm view. However, Berdiak himself defends his account as a different kind of harm-based account of the moral significance of risking. What do Power and Slavny say? Power and Slavny call this the autonomy account of the wrongness of risk imposition, as opposed to the harm account. But Maheswari seems to have good evidence that the autonomy account is a harm-based account. This is interesting. I almost want to track down the Oberdiak. Let's see. Let's at least see what Oberdiak 2012 is. This is the let me see if I can find the Oberdiak book online, because I have a hard copy. My hard copy's in my office, and it's not online. No legal copy online. Gotta sleep. Okay, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully I'll stream more in the future. Goodbye, Duck Rabbit. Oh, hey, you're the guy who does philosophy roulette, right? I don't know. Sorry, you may have gone to sleep already. But bye. Yeah, so I don't have this book. And I'm not going to bother opening this because I want to adjudicate this dispute with respect to the book, which is later. Okay, yeah, thanks for coming out. You were my inspiration for doing this. So glad to see you. Good night. I almost want to drag this under here now. Well, let me just say I'm convinced so far by Maheswari, but I'm not gonna, well, I don't know. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Okay. According to the autonomy account, in some cases, pure risk imposition constitutes harm, and thereby wrong is the agent because it hurts a certain precondition of autonomy. This precondition is having an adequate range of acceptable options to choose from, and explicating how risks affect this precondition. Already asks us to think of imposing risk as laying traps. Pure risk imposition, the argument goes, has the same effect for risk bearers as a trap. The trap takes away the option or more accurately renders unacceptable the exercise of the option of stepping where the trap has been set. If enough traps are laid, one's autonomy would be severely diminished. Similarly, in subjecting someone to risk, we foreclose someone's safe options. Lack of safe options has a constraining effect. It narrows one's range of acceptable choice-worthy options. Accordingly, sometimes exposing someone to risk entails a setback or diminution to one's autonomy. Since setting back one's autonomy interest is to make someone worse off, following Feinberg, Bill's risk imposition is constitutively harmful and therefore wrong. Is this verdict correct? Despite its initial plausibility argued, the claim is found wanting. To begin with, consider what he calls a non-material autonomy interest. On Feinberg's framework, when we speak of interest, we usually have in mind things which autonomous agents are invested in. Those interests are more accurately the things which interests are in are related either to an agent's ulterior personal goals and aims, such as writing a novel, living a flourishing life, maintaining physical health, etc., are related to conditions and goods that make it possible for agents to achieve their ulterior goals and aims, such as bodily integrity, emotional stability, physical health and vigor, minimal income, etc. Feinberg labels the former as one's ulterior interest and the latter as one's welfare interests. On his account of harm, only affecting the latter counts as harm, and only sometimes causing such harm is wrongful. Okay, autonomy understood here in Razian terms following. Why is that italicized? Following Arbradiak is not included in Feinberg's list of welfare interest. One might think that regardless, autonomy is a basic prerequisite for achieving one's ulterior interest and thus earns a rightful place on the list. If so, sorry. Okay, thus earns a rightful place on the list. If so, setting back one's autonomy interest by exposing them to risk constitutes harm and is thereby wrong. However, there are reasons to think otherwise. On Feinberg's framework, welfare interests are interests in conditions that are generalized means for achievement of more ultimate goals, namely one's ulterior interests. They require protection and preservation because without them, a person is simply lost. However, Feinberg makes clear that welfare interests are being treated as only as minimal but non-ultimate goods in the basic and that are basic requisites of man's well-being, but by no interest in the whole of that well-being itself. Accordingly, if autonomy is a welfare interest, then it's a relatively trivial good. It's necessary but insufficient for a good life. What do you mean relatively trivial? I don't. Is it because it's minimal? I don't think minimal means trivial. Okay. In contrast, on Raz's framework, the ideal of autonomy is construed not as a means for the good life, it's a kind of achievement that's an essential element of good life itself. For Raz, the autonomous life is of ultimate intrinsic value rather than instrumentally valuable for achieving one's interior. As Raz himself notes, if having an autonomous life is an ultimate value, then having a sufficient range of acceptable options is of intrinsic value, for it's a constituent of autonomous life that's lived in circumstances where acceptable alternatives are present. As Raz further notes, autonomy is to value people living in certain societies only, and hence not everyone is of value to people living in certain societies only, and hence not to everyone has an interest in personal autonomy. Respecting people's autonomy requires them give due consideration to all their interests that promote the preconditions for their autonomy or achieving an autonomous life. Autonomy then is not an interest in and of itself, rather it acts as a constraint on setting back interests of agents that are prerequisites for leading on an autonomous life. But if we treat autonomy in the Razian sense as a welfare interest and the Feinbergian sense as Albertiak does, then it's unclear how we can reconcile the idea of the Razian ideal of autonomy having ultimate value with the Feinbergian idea of autonomy as not having ultimate but typically instrumental value. The two ideas are at odds with each other. Thus, if autonomy has an interest falls out of the Razian framework, then this has an important implication for Albertiak's proposal. It follows is that risk is not constitutively harmful. Why? If the constitutive harm or risk consists in setting back the interests of an agent, and if autonomy in the Razian sense is not a welfare interest in and of itself in the Feinbergian sense for the reasons discussed here, then risk is not constitutively harmful by virtue of setting back one's autonomy interests, as the autonomy account claims. I heard something. Perhaps we can simply drop the language of interest on autonomy accounts commitment to Feinberg's notion of harm and reformulate Berdiak's proposal as follows. Sometimes imposing risk constitutes harm that is therefore wrong when it becomes risk negatively impacts one autonomy. Is the verdict correct? I'm not sure I'm even going to put this whole business in Hypernomicon. I think for now, no. Despite this reformulation, the autonomy account is open to a number of objections. First, consider the general problem. Reliance on autonomy implies that risk imposition is harmful only for those who at the time are leading autonomous lives or have the potential to do so. Suppose that Bill is laying risky traps on the road and the baby crawls towards them. If imposing risk is wrong because it's harmful with illicit diminishing one's autonomy, then Bill does not wrong the baby by virtue of harming her. Similar verdicts hold in the case involving those facing autonomy deficits like prisoners or agents with not yet developed rational capacities necessary for autonomous living. All right, while I think about that, we're lowering the standing desk to sitting. I am now seated. Great. Enough standing for now. It's been a couple hours of standing, I think. Thus, in these cases, the constitutive harm of risk of illicit autonomy diminishment fails to be the correct explanation of what makes imposing risk wrong. The failure is common to another type of. This failure is common to another type of where wrongful risk imposition forecloses or removes one's options, but fails to be constitutively harmful. Type of theory. Recall Brady-X position that, or argument type of, recall Brady-X position that sometimes risk diminishes autonomy by affecting one's adequate range of acceptable or safe options that a given person could exercise. But what constitutes an adequate range? Raz notes that to satisfy the conditions of the adequacy of the range of options, the options must be available must differ in respects which may rationally affect choice. Throughout the requirements, a variety of which is a precondition of the adequacy of the choice. Of the adequacy of options will not met. Accordingly, having an adequate range of options requires having a set of diverse choice-worthy options to choose from. This constitutes a benefit insofar as it fosters the conditions for determining the course of one's life by realizing some options and blocking others. Conversely, lacking a range of diverse valuable options to choose from, like a man stuck in a pit with the only option of eating and sleeping, is harmful insofar as it's detrimental to living an autonomous life. As Raz notes, not number but variety matters. Thus, if risk is constitutively harmful and thereby wrong, then if so, only in cases where it affects a variety of one's safe choice-worthy options. However, there are cases where wrongly imposing risk on others forecloses a range of similar options, but fails to have any negative effect on the variety of one's options. So suppose that Bill lays a risky trap on my walking path. Next morning, when I go the path, I notice the trap and decide to take one of the other different paths that are open to me. While Bill's risky position may have constrained my choice by removing one option, the important thing is that I still have some variety of safe options left to choose from. As long as this risk doesn't intervene with this, my autonomy is not interfered with in a way that makes it constitutively harmful. Accordingly, even if Bill's imposition of risk in this case is wrong, its wrongness so this is confusing because I don't understand the even, but like one might object the autonomy account only needs to show that in some cases opposing risk constitutes harmful, and when it's wrong, there is, however, still one reason to doubt whether it can do this successfully. Returning to the argument of core of Brady-X account, namely the analogy that imposing risk is like laying traps. Notice that Brady-X argues that imposing risk is like laying traps, rather than arguing that laying trap is an instance of risk. Okay, I don't know where that's going. The analogy drives home the point that just as laying a trap takes away safe options by creating the possibility that someone will get caught, and imposing a risk also takes away safe options by creating the mere possibility that someone will suffer material harm. The probability is not relevant to whether it affects one's autonomy. As Verdict notes, while risk is usually rightly regarded as a probability of harm, what's relevant about risk is the entailment of this, namely risk in the position also connotes the possibility of harm, according to the explanation. Okay, we're not going to read this for now. We're going to put this earlier stuff into Hypernomicon. This is not even, this is just, it's just about wrong. Okay, that was easy. This is not going in Hypernomicon. Too trivial. False too, I think. Okay. Okay. Accordingly, the explanation for what makes risk constitutionally harmful with less diminishing one's autonomy is that sometimes risk constitutes the mere possibility of suffering outcome harm, and when it does, the mere possibility suffices for risk to be harmful. Unfortunately, this way of construing the constitutive harm of risk is an implausible consequence. Consider three cases. In case this is going to be tedious because I think this argument has been made in par and what's his name, but we're reading it. Compare three cases. In case one, Bill sets up a trap in front of a door that works one out 2 times, therefore supposing you a 50% risk that you'll get caught in the trap. If you step into the trap in case two, everything is the same, except now the trap works one out 20 times, therefore exposing you to 5% risk. In case three, again, everything's the same, except now the trap works one out by 200 times, exposing you to a 0.5% risk. In each case, the risk you face constitutes or connotes the possibility of harm, even though the probability differs. Is there no difference between diminishing one's autonomy when we expose others to very high or very low risk of harm? As only the possibility of future harm matters. For reasons noted above, the autonomy account delivers the verdict that your autonomy is diminished to the same degree if you're exposed to 50% or 0.5 or anything in between. Accordingly, risk is harmful in the same way and to the same degree in every case. This entails the degree of wrongness involved in imposing risk in all three cases. It's almost at a par. It's also at a par, mutatis for any other blah blah blah. This, however, is counterintuitive. It intuitively assumes that if one is harmed by risk in position with less autonomy diminishment, then one is harmed more if the risk to self is 50% than when it's at, say, 5%. However, the autonomy account cannot capture this intuition. Moreover, by rendering any degree of risk as constitutively harmful, the autonomy account seems to treat our everyday mundane actions as instances of harm insofar as all our accounts carry some risk for others. In doing so, the account trivializes so many typos, trivializing the moral significance of harming, much in the same way we encountered earlier with the preference account. That the risk of harm is rendered trivial becomes evident when comparing the harm of pure risk with the case where the risk materializes. Suppose again that Bill sets up a trap in front of your door. In one case, your risk faces a 5% risk of getting trapped, but luckily nothing happens. In another case, the risk materializes, you get trapped. In the former case, the autonomy account delivers the verdict you're harmed because the risk of getting trapped diminishes your autonomy. Your safe options are stepping out for clothes. The account delivers the same verdict for the latter case where you're actually trapped. Your safe options to move around are foreclosed, despite the difference in which your autonomy. It's, however, problematic because it blurs the intuitive normative difference between wrongful autonomy and diminishment, which when one suffers the outcome harm. So many typos. And when someone is exposed to the mere risk of harm, I conclude that the consideration, okay, we put this in Hypernomicon because it's already in there. I conclude that the considerations count against the success of the autonomy account in locating the harm, the wrong of imposing pure risk, and risk being whatever. If defenders of the harm view still want to explain what makes pure risk imposition wrong in terms of risk itself being harmful, they must locate the harm of risk elsewhere. This brings us to the contingent claim. The contingent claim holds that pure risk imposition is pro tanto wrong when and because risk has harmful consequences for risk bearer. Accordingly, that risk itself is harmful and thereby wrong. Depends on what risk causes rather than what it constitutes. The contingent claim is thus immune to the various problems that constitutive claim. We'll keep reading before we decide how to put this in Hypernomicon. Theorists often appeal to psychological distress, such as fear and anxiety, in spelling out the contingent claim. Suppose that you see Bill driving recklessly towards you, likely you notice in time and jump out of the way. Your quick reaction prevents the risk of accident from materializing for you. Nevertheless, as you experience unpleasant levels of stress and anxiety, Bill's risk imposition is pro tanto wrong because risk has these harmful effects for you. In some cases, it can lead to further harmful effects. For instance, the fear induced by being exposed to risk may force you to go out of your way to avoid the risk by taking costly or difficult precautionary steps. It's therefore very plausible that experiencing these effects is detrimental to your well-being. The harm view then successfully generates a harm-based account. Sorry, what's it called? The harm view? What is the harm view? Have we seen this? Oh. Because the risk is harmful. Okay. The harm view then successfully generates a harm-based explanation for why imposing risk is wrong in case where the risk itself has harmful effects. Why is it called the harm view and not the contingent claim? However, this also means the harm view is limited in its explanatory scope, as the name suggests the contingent claim only captures cases where the relevant contingent effects obtains. Suppose that unbeknownst to you, Bill drives recklessly towards you while you're walking blindfolded on the street. As you often do. Consequently, this time you do not experience any psychological distress. Intuitively, Bill wrongs you by subjecting you to risk and typically have relevant harmful effects. The harm view, however, cannot offer us an explanation for what makes Bill's conduct wrong. Moreover, in cases where the relevant harmful effects do obtain, whatever those effects may be, it's not always clear whether risk itself is one of the necessary but insufficient causes of the harmful effect. For instance, suppose that as a matter of fact, the chances that Bill injures you by driving around recklessly 1 in 1,000. When you see him driving towards you, you experience a lot of distress and fear because you overestimate the risk of him crashing into you. You think that Bill is in fact exposing you to 1 in 2 chance of a serious accident. Despite Bill's risk and position resulting in harmful effects, it's at least as plausible as not necessary that these effects are caused by your heightened and exaggerated perception and or evaluation of riskiness in Bill's driving, or perhaps this harmful effects could be caused by your expectation or anticipation of getting into an accident with him, or it might be that your distress is facilitated or radiated by your awareness and knowledge that you're being exposed to some non-negligible risk that may materialize for you and so forth. In such scenarios, the risk itself is not one of the necessary but insufficient causes of the harmful effect, and Bill's risky contact is not wrong by virtue of the risk itself being contingentally harmful, even though it's bad for you to experience these effects. Bill wrongs you by subjecting you to 1,000 risk of crashing into you. However, wrongness is not explained by risk itself being contingently harmful. This doesn't necessarily counts as a strike against the harm view insofar as it correctly captures some cases where the risk itself has harmful effects on risk bearers. It only means the harm view is insufficient as a general exhaustive account. What makes imposing risk wrong for 2 reasons. First, in case of wrongful risk imposition where contingentally harmful. I think that was the song making a weird noise. Case of wrongful risk imposition where contingent harmful effects are present if the risk itself is not more than necessary but not sufficient cause of the effects, then the risk itself is not harmful and thereby wrong. Second, the risk itself is contingently harmful and thereby wrong. It's only true for a narrow risk of cases. This means if we want to capture the wrongness of a wide range of risk imposition cases, we need to look beyond the harm view. Okay, seems like a waste of time, but let's just put this in. Fine. Doesn't every... I have engaged in detailed discussion of the prominent view of the ethics of risk imposition, namely harm view. I've argued that the harm view is plausible only on the contingent. So this, by the way, while we're keeping score, this is like a purely negative paper. Sometimes people, I like writing these things. I write a lot of these. And sometimes it feels kind of hard to get them published because people want you to be making like some sort of positive thing. But like, so many people publish things like this, including me sometimes. So I'm going to keep writing them. I've argued that harm view is plausible on the contingent claim, fails on the contingent claim. In discussing the contingent claim, I've argued that preference on autonomy views is construed by Finkelstein and Oberdiak, respectively fail to show that risk is constitutively harmful and thereby wrong. I'm vindicating the idea that risk itself is constitutively harmful. Both accounts are found guilty of either trivializing or undermining the moral significance of risk or having counterintuitive implications. Case where the risk materialize. I discussed the contingent claim. In discussing, I've argued the risk is only contingently harmful and they're wrong only in a narrow range of cases. To make the harm view explanatory and limited in scope, thereby undermining its plausibility as a general exhaustive view. What makes pure imposition wrong? I want to